Okay, cool. So, um, thank you very much, everyone, for that excellent debate. Truly very, very high quality. I think even just discussing or thinking about the teams that were maybe at the bottom at times, I think should have been on top. I think it was a really high quality debate. I also think that by way of general feedback, there's not actually much I can offer. The only piece of general feedback I have is potentially just a knowledge gap that some teams maybe demonstrated at times. So I kind of encourage everyone to maybe read up on all the different leagues that exist in different sports, and especially the more common sports, and how they actually reflect themselves in different countries. Because I think cross-border wise, this debate could have done a little bit more. And additionally, I think the use of more common examples or more examples in general would have assisted people mechanistically and also in determining what the most important impacts in the debate were. So, in what I thought was an extremely difficult decision to make, and I think that the ballot reflects how high quality this debate was. So in that way, I guess everyone's a winner. I gave the debate as a closing half, the first to closing opposition, the second to closing government, the third to opening opposition, and the fourth to opening government. So let's start with the opening half. What I'll firstly do is simply explain the issue of youth success and whether or not they succeed contract wise and sports wise, and then I'll talk to the second issue, which opening government does a pretty good job of positioning, which is the quality of the contract with respect to the players' welfare. So, in the first issue of player success, I think opening opposition does a slightly better job here. They explain that it's kind of hard to succeed, and there are issues with internal competitions, and so internal competition within the youth academy, and so it's just easier to get your guaranteed pipeline into a team or into a club. Where I'm not sure what level of league or what level of league these clubs are, extracting young people from, sorry, extracting young people into. But I think that opening opposition kind of more clearly explains that these people will be employed at the end of the day. I want to note that there's a very good question that is raised by opening government at Deputy Prime Minister, which is what is the benefit of being in a club? Like, it's not necessarily clear that people should be these elite sports stars, or it's not even clear that they'll even be at the elite level. I think opening opposition lacks analysis there. But I think even though this is a really great question to raise and questions the position of this argument, that the reason why I favored this, the reason why I thought this argument was important was for two main reasons. The first is because the actor is largely choosing this. So these set of people who are, opting into sports and doing really well at sports and maybe get scouted or care to be scouted are often opting in themselves. And opening opposition does explain this earlier in their case, which doesn't really receive a direct response. Secondly, I think in comparison to the other teams in the debate, especially the closing teams that raise really powerful argumentation, that those arguments are about the success in these leagues. And so, insofar as I think that those arguments are more persuasive in the debate, the opening teams that interact best with the question of whether or not these players will succeed, as I'll explain why the success of those players succeeding is important later in this adjudication. And I think it was kind of clear throughout the debate. I think the player's success is kind of important. And so the mechanisms that opening opposition provide are kind of successful here. They explain that there's a little bit more funding as a result of feeling more safe as a club to invest in youth academies. And I think they also talk about how trainer feedback means that it's not impossible for you to succeed in getting a contract. Let's turn then to the question of better contracts. Here, opening government basically explains that these clubs don't compete and they are not innovating because they can basically have a monopoly of a set of people who come into their clubs. And so there's no incentive to improve their quality of life. There's no incentive to make sure that they have very good training. This is a fine mechanism. I think a quite well made argument, but I think opening opposition explains it. Firstly, this is exceptionally hard to do. So, yes, I think it is possible that people can go into these clubs and pick the clubs that are best for them. But the question is, will they actually be able to enter those clubs that they prefer? It's not clear that they're going to select the clubs that are best for them. And I think that the reason is simply because of all the reasons opening opposition gives for why, for a lot of young people, it's actually kind of hard to get to the skill level where you have the optionality. Because, if you're competing against so many people, if it's hard to get scouted properly and scouted well, if it's hyper competitive, if it's also such that you have to give up the rest of your life, like for example, school and stuff like that, then for that reason, I think it's kind of hard to be able to build the skills to be to be in a position where you have the leverage and the power asymmetry to select what clubs you go into. So the question of whether or not you can select the clubs that you want is actually in doubt. Secondly, I think there's a presumption by opening government, which is a fine claim, but I think maybe needs a little bit more work. And I think I might have to end to the debate in order to credit this, which is the claim that, well, smaller clubs have better, have better treatment, or clubs which have a lower threshold for skill treat their players better. I think opening opposition questions this kind of well, where they explain, well, if you're a big team, if you're a large team, you largely have better training, and so if I think that they have more resources, more capital, it's not necessarily clear that the lower teams or any other team that is not super powerful, that where a lot of the talent is concentrated, and a lot of the clubs that are able to monopolize more youth academies, any clubs outside of that, I'm not sure are going to be so much better for the stakeholders we're talking about here. So simply, I'm saying I think opening government's material is very good, but at times I think there's a question over whether or not this will actually occur and whether or not this is actually a good thing if you think a little bit more about it. So for that reason, I think opening opposition, sorry, on those two most important issues in the opening half is able to get ahead. Let's talk about closing government then. Their extension is they have a few things, but I'm just going to skip to the most important one just for now, which is the one about player welfare and the quality of contracts. Here they extend on their opening in a, I think, slightly more grounded way, where they basically explain that, well, in the status quo, you don't want to give your rivals human capital, even if that human capital is at the middling level. So that means that you sign people or sign lots and lots of contracts to deprive them of people to train and to deprive them of people to build up into off the bench and onto the field. So what this basically means is that there are large clubs, and I presume it's a very large and very powerful clubs, and this is quite intuitive. They are the ones who monopolize a lot of contracts, and that means the set of people who are just deprived from other clubs, they basically have to sit on the bench and they don't get to train as much. I would note closing government's claim here, I think, is at times a little bit exaggerated. I don't necessarily think they prove that these people never train or never ever get an opportunity. I agree, maybe they don't get to play a lot of the games, but I do think maybe they maybe improve to some degree, and I'll explain why closing opposition's responses are very, very strong. But irrespective, this extension itself, I think, is quite persuasive. And let's compare them then to their opening. Compared to opening government's claim about innovation, I'm just not sure clubs are actually affected by the competition mechanism as soundly as opening government says. As I mentioned before, it's not clear that these players will have as much leverage or power in order to inspire that competition mechanism. And I'm not sure that what specifically clubs will do in order to innovate. I think opening government at times assumes that clubs have poor treatment of players, which I'm very, very willing to believe. But I just needed structural reasons for why these clubs would take you to the max and hurt you and cause you damage, such that you are not able to be a functioning player or be a worse playing player. For that reason, I think that the question of innovation has a question mark over it, and so for that reason, closing government's more sound mechanism of, well, clubs have a market incentive to buy up resources and real estate in terms of human capital. I think that's slightly more certain. So for that reason, I think the impact from CG just lands a little stronger for me. Then I think that the claim from if to the extent that I believe opening government's material, which is very persuasive, but closing government explains that their material is logically prior. So they simply explain that in order to have high quality contracts and in order to have a high quality career, such that opening government's benefits can be activated, you need to first be able to tap into those benefits. So yes, you may get some training, but do you get the best training in your team? Do you get the same training as everyone else in your team? And yes, you may get some. Another question is, do you even get to train? Do you even get to get on the field? It's just a question of all the benefits that opening government has. First, the question must be answered. Can you actually tap into the assets of this team that you are so happily entering? And I think closing government questions that a little bit. Engages in that question uniquely. And that question, I think, is logically prime and therefore a little bit more important in the debate. Then let's compare closing government's material to opening oppositions. So, opening opposition's material does a really good job of establishing how players are more likely to, how players find it hard to succeed without any, without clubs having the certainty that those players would come into their clubs. I think that's a fine mechanism. But what closing government does at the end is I think they attack the claim about you even being taken into clubs in the first place. Like, I'm not sure opening opposition proves that yes, you may have the priority over certain youth academy, but I need a question of what's the quantum of people who are leaving that youth academy with a contract into that team. And I think that closing government questions the quality of those contracts in a different way to opening government, and also questions how many people even get brought up in a way or scooped up in a way that is desirable. And I also think that closing government questions the practical imperative for opening opposition's case. Like, is it actually that hard to scout people? You can do things like turn to match stats. You can turn to things like talk to people and get feedback from them, such that you understand those players. So I think that the ability, if it is true that we want to scout people in higher quality ways, closing government suggests some practical ways that we can work around that. So the imperative that opening opposition sets is substantially mitigated by closing government here. Let's bring in closing opposition. So their extension is that, well, that there is an investment into young youth academies, which is higher, just slightly better. I think the impacting is just very good. Here they explain that, well, you have more certainty or have a little bit more confidence in investing in youth academies in more diverse and also poorer and also intercontinental places, which I think is a pretty good benefit for a wide set of people. They also do a little bit more impacting in terms of the set of stakeholders who are affected in this debate and go way beyond the players who are affected, but also the support staff or the tangential set of people who benefit from this part of the economy. So I think the impacting from closing opposition is quite sophisticated in the debate. And I also think their mechanism is at times potentially similar, but I think distinct enough. They simply, but the most persuasive part or the most unique part is where they explain that it's not even just like you're not even sure if you want to hire someone because it's not even I think the claim around how some clubs engage in training with the youth academy, and it's not just about looking at the youth academy from afar. They actually drill down into how some of these youth academies and clubs work in specifically, and what their contracts actually look like. It sometimes looks like training those kids directly, and I think that that's a really good mechanism because it talks about how actually you won't invest in that training as much anymore, or you won't give them those skills anymore because you're afraid of leaks. And I think this is a unique mechanism. I don't necessarily think it's the winning mechanism in the debate, but it's unique enough that I think that this argument about certainty and the ability to set up youth academies or invest in youth academies, it's distinct enough. I think it's kind of persuasive. Let's compare them to the rest of the debate then. So in comparison to opening government, I think that so actually, firstly, I'll compare them to closing government first. So closing government has some pretty good responses to closing opposition's case. And some of that mitigation from whip is kind of good. So, for example, well, you're not going to go to places where it's uncertain. You're just going to set up in places where there's actual statistics of people and youth academies, and set up youth academies that are actually going to, in areas that are actually kind of good. But I think that this kind of ignores the asymmetry CO is setting up is explaining. I don't think CO proves that all clubs are going to now set up or are now just going to invest wholly into setting up new youth academies in different countries. I think they're just simply explaining that the incentive to do so asymmetrically falls under closing opposition side, simply because the monopoly effect of having those people to yourself as a club means that you would set them up. And I think this is the claim from I think this claim from the closing opposition team is made slightly more specifically, and with regard to how these youth academies and how these clubs work, they use a lot of examples and they use the mechanisms of what they actually kind of look like in order to uniquely make this claim. So I don't think closing government defeats the argument the opening closing opposition is making. They simply mitigate it to an extent that I don't think it's going to take that argument out. I also think that. The claim about benching is kind of well mitigated by CO. So when CG is like, "Well, you'll be benched," I think CO is the best. CO, the op whip does a pretty good job of explaining. Well, it's not clear that you'll be benched all the time, and I'm also kind of questioning whether or not that benching is as significant as I say. And CO, I think, is the only team to basically weaponize just how long these contracts exist for. Yes, they exist for quite a significant amount of time, but those contracts get renewed, they change. So I think regard to how contract law works assists CO's case here. So for that reason, I think CO, a good judge, I think, would give it to either CG or CO. But in this circumstance, for those reasons, I gave it to CO. Then in comparing CO to opening opposition, I think that it's the comparison about youth academies being broke or not. This is not a knife. It's just a different characterization. I just don't know. My feedback to any team in the debate is maybe don't call it a knife, but I'm willing to accept these two characterizations. OO's material is quite good, but I think CO does a pretty good job of pointing out where the change in the debate is most significant. So they explain where when we're setting up a new youth academy, that doesn't just have impacts on the kids themselves or the young people themselves, but the support staff as well. They also explain where these youth academies are set up, which I think is very useful and specific material. So simply just the attention to detail and specificity in the way in which these youth academies are invested in, I think, means that I'm more persuaded by the op bench through CO's material itself. And so for that reason, I think CO kind of edges out COO here. This is also another pretty close split. Then in comparison with opening government, I think at the end of the day, what happens is the contracts maybe get better under opening government side, but I think that the the question of how much better they get, given that I needed a little bit more work on all the mechanisms I described before coming at in the opening half, which I had struggle in, determining how OG won against OO there. I think that same principle kind of applies to CO here as well. So closing opposition's material just has, as I mentioned before, a slightly more certain, margin of change. Whereas with respect to opening government, I think that change is a little bit more speculative. And so for that reason, I think I would prefer closing opposition's case. So that's how I saw the debate. I'm more than willing to take questions, and thank you so much for what I thought was, a super, super high quality, performance. Everyone did super well. Thank you so much.